Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. The title of my talk is stolen directly from a book, the book being Scatter, Adapt, and Remember. And the reason I picked it for this particular talk is that it is about extinction. It is about the end of the world, and it is about how humans will survive the end of the world. And so I thought it would be useful as a strategy for figuring out how content and culture can survive this world. And the title is The Strategy. You scatter, meaning you leave the location where the tsunamis are hitting, where the earthquakes are happening, where the jungle is dying, where the glaciers are dying, where the publishers are dying. You adapt, meaning you figure out how to occupy a new environment. And you remember, which means that you learn lessons both from your past and from the new environments that you're meeting, and you tell stories with them, because stories are how we remember. And the moment at which effectively Homo sapiens came into real being was the moment when we learned to tell stories. When 70,000 years ago, we started to leave Africa, scattering, finding new environments, the less warm climate in Northern Europe. My last time in Milan, it was in February of 2012, when it was minus 16 degrees. So we adapted, and I remembered. So the environment from which books came, right, from which stories originally came, is our minds, is the culture that we created. And of course, before there were publishers, there were still stories, right? And this, in many ways, is representative of pre-publisher publishing. And in the world of pre-publisher publishing, of course, there were publishers, but they didn't call themselves publishers. They called themselves the Catholic Church. Or they called themselves king, or warlord, or emperor. So there were publishers that used power to control narrative. Now, there were other stories, other than the stories that the church told and that the precursors of the state told. And those were stories about farming, when to plant, when it was going to rain, what you did if it rained, and about love, and about who to trust and who not to trust. But those stories weren't written down. But they were told, and they were passed around one another. And in that regard, you could call this a time of some stories and few books. The books were the only books that the state and the church would allow, and the stories, we don't know how many they were. But they were stories that belonged to the society. They didn't belong to one person. They were told and retold like the air. It was an inhalation and an exhalation of story. Now, obviously, the book business put an end to that time. Ironically, that time was economically the very, very, very best time ever to be a writer, before there were printers. because that is the only time in human history when a writer was guaranteed a job simply because they could write. Now, of course, the job wasn't that much fun. It wasn't like writing today. We weren't inventing our own stories. We were retelling other stories. We were human machines for reproducing text. But at least writers had a job. So obviously Gutenberg and Aldus Manutius put an end to that, right? We didn't need humans to make copies anymore. And we entered a sort of a new era for the creation and distribution of stories. And this era was quite revolutionary. And the revolution extended beyond merely the fact that for the first time, humans were capable of mass reproduction of things. It is, of course, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? It's the first time we could make perfect copies of anything. Centuries, not just 400 years before film, but 200 years before we could make perfect copies of clothes. Hundreds of years before we could make perfect copies of microphones, of anything that surrounds us right now. And one of the other areas of innovation that had occurred in that time, I just realized I put my slide out of order. So this is mass reproduction. But before that, that slide was a picture of a bookshop in the 18th century. And a second area of revolution that publishing introduced was that it transformed retail. Retail typically involved a person walking up to a table and asking for what they wanted. 5 pounds of sugar, 5 kilos of flour. And then a person went into the back, brought it out, put it on the table in front of you, and you walked out. The bookstore was the first place where the consumer was permitted to see what they were going to buy, to browse what they were going to buy before they bought it. It was the sort of first moment in the history of consumer empowerment, when the consumer was in charge of what they bought rather than the producer. And that process accelerated, obviously, as the Industrial Revolution and steam-driven industry could attach themselves to printing presses and create ever more books. And then in the 20th century, while this is not quite on the scale of the printing press or the invention of retail, this is the Penguincubator. This is the founder of Penguin Press in the UK, a man named Alan Lane. He's credited as the inventor of the paperback, but of course we know Aldus Manutius invented the octavo. So the 20th century improver of the paperback was Alan Lane. But more critically than merely inventing the paperback, he invented the vending machine, because he wanted to put the stories where the people were, rather than make the people come to where the stories are. And so he installed vending machines on train station platforms, in squares in London for the commuters, because he had a vision that books would be cheap and convenient. They would be the price of a pack of cigarettes. So this effectively becomes an era where we have very few stories, but very many books. And Jeff Bezos becomes the apotheosis of that, except that Bezos, to go back, the Alan Lane had represented the moment where economies of scale were the primary driver. And that had the effect of reducing the total number of stories available. If you are in the business of manufacturing, you want the fewest possible SKUs, the fewest numbers of products, the fewest titles, and the most number of copies. Right? So you're not interested in stories. Stories are what make you money. Copies are what make you money. And Bezos represents not a new moment in publishing in that regard, in many respects, but the extreme end of the idea that the story is a thing to be reproduced, that cheapness and convenience, which was introduced by Alan Lane at Penguin in the 1920s, achieves its apotheosis with Amazon. Jeff Bezos is the true inheritor of the publishing tradition rather than its destroyer. But of course, the reality is that everybody who pushes something as far as it can possibly go starts to sow the seeds of undermining that moment. And so Bezos, while with print culture, he's driving it to its logical conclusion of the cheapest possible books made as easy as possible for you to buy with one click. He also introduces the Kindle, and he supports self-publishing. And so in that moment, the number of stories for the first time starts to increase. And that becomes the beginning of the end of the industrial era of publishing, an era that reduced the number of stories but increased the number of copies. So Bezos, while he may represent the end of a particular moment in the business of books, there is a man prior to Bezos who represents a new way of understanding what was inside the book. And in many ways, I could have picked many different writers to exemplify this. In the back of the little books that we have hanging around our necks are a bunch of lovely quotes from other writers who were just as capable of talking about the rich and dense material that you find within books. But what Borges in particular emphasized is that a book is not a thing. And in some senses, a book is not even complete. A book is a blueprint. A book is lines of code that run a program inside your brain. As he said, it is not just the structures, but it is the interaction between the writer and the reader, the images it leaves in the reader's brain, and the change in intonation, he says, the change in tone, the change in emotions that inhabit us. And that therefore it is not one thing, but it is many relationships going out in many, many, many different directions. And this, I believe, is the core of what post-publisher publishing or post-industrial publishing has to focus on, is not the book as thing, but the book as a container of not just a story, but of all the possible stories that occur within a narrative. So the situation this therefore leaves us in is a situation both via Jeff Bezos, and when I say Jeff Bezos, I am referring to the entire universe of tools, technical distribution. I could be referring to Steve Jobs just as easily, all the various tools that are available for anybody to now tell stories. And over the course of the rest of today, other speakers are going to go into much greater depth around all the various things that we can do with all these tools. But one of the things that is for certain when we have all these tools now is that we have way more publishers than we ever had before. And what I think is interesting is to think of that not just in terms of individuals, but in terms of also companies, that any company can now be a publisher. Now, why, given what we believe is the future of publishing, which is declining print revenues, whether in the United States or in Italy, or anywhere in the West, why in an era of declining print revenue would a non-book publisher bother to try to be a publisher? Surely that's the exact opposite of what any industry should be doing to mimic the activities of a dying industry. And the reason I suggest that this makes sense is that this is a diagram from a company called Bluefire, which is an independent provider of e-reading software and e-book e-commerce. They provide white label solutions to a number of retailers and publishers in the US, Europe, and Asia. They're a relatively small company, so they actually share their data, unlike the larger companies you have heard of that don't. And what they discovered recently is that over 1/3 of the people reading on their device spent an hour a day reading. Now, to compare that, Facebook typically gets about 30 minutes a day. So by far the most dominant social network in the world, the thing that we believe everybody has their noses glued to, achieves only 1/2 of the average session time that 1/3 of the people reading. So it's probably, although they didn't organize their data in convenient increments for my talk, but as best we can tell, the average session time for reading a book on a device is also 30 minutes. So books are actually extremely powerful tools for winning attention, for winning focus. And this puts us in a situation, therefore, where when you have people who are trying to compete for attention, whether they're banks, like they are here, or companies that make sneakers, or companies that make drugs, or whether they're individuals who have been bypassed by the gatekeepers of publishing, if you want attention, strangely enough, what you might consider doing is not making things shorter, but making things longer. Because when you make it longer, there is more opportunity for immersion. So here's an example of a book that the US independent book publisher McSweeney's was commissioned to make for Converse sneakers. They make a book for Converse every year, and Converse pays them extremely well to do so. I can't say how much they pay them, but it is close to the equivalent of their entire profits from the publishing of books by their traditional authors. This is a company that I've been helping for the last 6 months, Byliner. And what Byliner is doing is focusing not on the book as traditionally understood, but on the attention span of people who read books. So Byliner takes short stories, narrative nonfiction from magazines and websites and essays, and combines them all into a single service, a single digital magazine with 15,000 stories. And it is organized, if I can find my little pointer device, it is organized This is me telling me that I need to hurry up. Does this work? Okay, so it is organized by time, so that if you have 0 to 10 minutes, you click that button and it tells you all the stories that you can read within 10 minutes and so on, 10 to 20, 20 plus. We also arranged it so that it could have collections, so that whether a story comes from a website or a magazine or as an excerpt from a book, if it happens to be about Russia, we put it into a collection about Russia the month before the Olympics, or if it is Mardi Gras time, we did the same thing for New Orleans, thereby allowing us to create books out of other books, but also, and this is part of the longer-term business plan, allowing us to find sponsors who might want to be associated with a bunch of stories around New Orleans or Russia or love or cars. So then we also have, this is the company I was working at before that, Small Demons. What Small Demons did was to find all the references in books to people, places, music, movies, food, cars, guns, events, drugs, and link them up. And so that what that would have allowed us to do, had we actually been able to deploy this before we ran out of money, is to allow for horizontal browsing in media, so that if you wanted to build a competitor to, let's say, iTunes, and wanted to find a new way of discovering content within iTunes, what we allow them to do is when they have a page that's about the movie, we can tell you all the books that mention the movie. Or a page about a song would give you a quote from a novel that mentioned the song. And a page about a book would list all the songs mentioned in a book, allowing people to effectively find story, find culture horizontally, rather than within the narrow confines of the environment itself. This last example here is an app that connects weather and poetry. So they have tagged thousands of poems with descriptions of what kind of weather it is associated with. And so when you wake up in the morning and open your app and it is snowing, but it's April, it will give you a poem about how winter stayed late in Lake Chapala this year. So it is an opportunity effectively to take all the stories that exist and make them available via some other trajectory. I'm going to skip past Oprah. Although I will very quickly say that Oprah is an example of a person who took a book club and made a cable network out of it, who basically took books and used the fact that people read books at home, at work, listen to books in the cars, and use that to obtain 24-hour, 7-day-a-week mind share. Oprah followed you into the bathroom and into the cafeteria, into the bedroom via her book club, and she followed up on that by launching a 24-hour cable network. So this last thing that I'm going to leave you with, and I'm sorry for running a tiny bit over time, is a table from a study about the future of work. And it is an exploration of what jobs and what types of jobs are likely to be lost to computerization, automation, roboticization. And you'll notice up there that jobs like commercial air pilot have a 55% chance of having significant job losses over the next 10 years. And up at the very top dentists have a very low likelihood, because who wants a robot drilling into your tooth, right? But right there, much closer to dentist than economist, or closer to a yoga instructor than a commercial pilot, is editor. Which is effectively because there is a recognition that story is everywhere. And story is a part of every industry, not just the book publishing industry. And that the process of making language better is a high touch, high emotion, high psychology, high cultured activity. As a result of which, a friend of mine, I'm going to show you the LinkedIn page for a, where did this go? There we go. A friend of mine who was the editor of NewYorker.com for 5 years, a very prestigious job in the American magazine industry, trying to reinvent the magazine for the digital age. But he is no longer there. Instead, he is now the managing editor of a 3D printer, a company called MakerBot that has introduced 3D printing for consumers. And his job is to tell the stories, in many times, yes, by video, but also advise on print and digital publishing projects and partnerships, making print books about a 3D printer. And that is post-publisher publishing. Thank you very much.